It was a mild afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the kind that promised nothing remarkable. The gardens hummed quietly under the weight of June, and the tea table beneath Mrs. Bantry's sycamore was set with strawberry tarts, cucumber sandwiches, and a gleaming pot of Darjeeling that had already cooled once. The vicar's wife was complaining about the new postmistress, Miss Carrow, who had the disagreeable habit of reading telegrams upside down, while Colonel Melchett contributed his usual blustering remarks about modern inefficiency. Miss Marple, seated just a little apart from the chatter, was darning a small tear in her glove. She smiled faintly from time to time, though she had not said a word in 15 minutes. Her pale blue eyes moved from one speaker to the next, attentive in the gentle, unassuming way that had deceived generations of villagers into thinking her mind wandered somewhere among lace curtains and knitting needles. In truth, she noticed everything. The tremor in Mrs. Bantry's voice when she mentioned the police, the slight stiffness in the vicar's smile when the word "inspector" came up. For Inspector Godfrey had been the subject of half the afternoon's talk. His unexpected return to the village, after retiring to London 5 years ago, had caused no small amount of speculation. Some said he had come to sell his old cottage. Others whispered that he was writing a book about his most famous cases. Yet there were those, like the grocer's wife, who insisted he had been seen arguing with a man near the old railway gate late one evening. "Godfrey always did have enemies," said Colonel Melchett, helping himself to another sandwich. "Too fond of exposing what people wanted left hidden." Miss Marple's needle paused mid-air. It was one of her quiet habits, this brief stillness when something pricked the deeper part of her attention. She resumed her work almost immediately, but the rhythm of her stitching slowed. By the time the church clock struck 4, a light mist had begun to creep over the garden. The guests rose, exchanged polite farewells, and went their separate ways down the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, walking home alone, noticed that the cottage once belonging to Inspector Godfrey had its gate half open, an untidy sight for a man known for precision. She hesitated, then moved on, telling herself there was no reason to trouble a retired policeman with her curiosity. It was not until the next morning, when the milk boy found the cottage door ajar and the inspector lying face down beside his breakfast tray, that St. Mary Mead stirred with a thrill of real scandal. By noon, the entire village was whispering in parlors and post offices. The inspector had been murdered. That much was certain. But who could have wished harm upon a man long retired from his duty? Miss Marple, standing quietly at her garden gate, watched as the constable cycled past toward the scene. She murmured, softly, as if to herself, "People don't change so very much, you know. They only learn to hide what they are." Then she turned back inside, already thinking of the open gate, the cold tea, and the faint trace of cigar smoke that had drifted through the sycamores yesterday afternoon. By early afternoon, the inspector's cottage had become the quiet center of every mind in St. Mary Mead. The police had come and gone with their notebooks, leaving a faint trail of muddy footprints across the flagstone path. A curious hush lingered over the street, as though even the sparrows had decided that gossip, for once, ought to wait its turn. Miss Marple, who had walked down to the grocer's for her weekly butter ration, was not surprised to find Mrs. Price Ridley loitering near the hedge, feigning interest in a climbing rose that was quite past its best. "They say he was poisoned," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley, lowering her voice though no one was near enough to overhear. "In his morning tea, no less. Imagine, a man who spent his life catching murderers meeting his end with a breakfast cup in hand." Miss Marple nodded gravely. "It's a curious world, Mrs. Price Ridley, though sometimes I think murderers have rather a taste for irony." The other woman blinked, uncertain whether to laugh or be unsettled. Miss Marple, with the mildest smile, moved on toward the cottage. The constable on duty at the gate recognized her at once. "Morning, Miss Marple. Best not go in, ma'am. Inspector Cray's still taking statements." "Oh, quite right, she said pleasantly. I only wondered if there's anyone to see about his poor cat. He was fond of that tabby, I recall." The constable hesitated. "Yes, well, perhaps you might have a look then. She's been crying something awful." It was not a lie, of course. Miss Marple did look for the cat, a thin little creature trembling beneath the hearth bench, but while she moved about the small, tidy rooms, her eyes took in more than any constable might have thought to notice. The teacup still on the table bore a faint rim of sugar at one edge, and another cup, empty, rested opposite, with a small indentation where lipstick had once been. The inspector had not breakfasted alone. On the sideboard lay a pile of letters neatly tied with twine. The top one bore an unfamiliar handwriting, firm but slanted, with a faint smudge of violet ink near the fold. Miss Marple did not touch it, but she leaned close enough to see the initials. C.L. She left quietly, thanking the constable for his kindness and promising to return the cat once it calmed. As she walked home, she thought of all the small things one learns by listening. Inspector Godfrey had not been a man who courted company. His visits to the village had been brisk, polite, and often solitary. If he had shared breakfast with a woman, it was someone he trusted, or believed he did. By dusk, the lanes were buzzing again. The vicar's wife insisted it was suicide. The postmistress swore she'd seen a stranger arrive by the early train. Colonel Melchett was certain it was an old enemy from the inspector's days in London. Miss Marple merely sat by her window, listening to the murmurs carried by the wind. She was not convinced of any of it. People lied without meaning to, especially when fear and curiosity walked side by side. That night, as the church bell struck 9, a soft knock came at Miss Marple's door. It was Inspector Cray, a neat, harried-looking man with ink stains on his cuff, and the kind of expression that tried to hide irritation behind courtesy. "I'm told you knew the deceased well, Miss Marple." "Not well, Inspector," she said, "but I knew his habits. He was tidy, punctual, and particular about his tea. The kind of man who never left his gate open." Inspector Cray frowned. "Ah, you noticed that too." "I did," said Miss Marple gently, "and I dare say someone else noticed it before me, someone who knew he would open it again if it wasn't just so. Human nature, Inspector. We're all slaves to our little patterns." Cray studied her for a moment, uncertain whether she was helping him or lecturing him. Then he sighed. "The doctor says the tea contained a strong dose of digitalis. Not something one keeps by accident." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "It requires knowledge, and a reason." She closed the door behind him after he left, and stood for a long moment in the hallway, listening to the wind stirring the lilacs outside. Somewhere in the distance, the tabby cat cried again, a thin, mournful sound that spoke less of hunger than of absence. Miss Marple turned down her lamp, but sleep did not come easily. In her mind, she saw the 2 cups again, the one with sugar, the one with lipstick, and the faintest curl of cigar smoke beneath the sycamores the day before. It was not yet a pattern, but it was beginning to form the shape of one. The following morning brought with it the pale, steady drizzle that always seemed to make St. Mary Mead look both innocent and guilty at once. Miss Marple, standing at her window, watched the mist clinging to the hedges and roofs as though it wished to conceal the village entirely. People liked to believe that evil came in storms or thunderclaps, but she had lived long enough to know it often arrived quietly, with rain on the doorstep and milk bottles clinking softly by the gate. Inspector Cray appeared again before noon, looking more worn than before. His collar was damp, his notebook soggy at the corners, and he had that restless air of a man who had gathered too many facts and not enough sense to order them. He accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea, though she noticed he didn't drink it right away, and began pacing before her small fire. "Funny business, Miss Marple. No sign of forced entry, no theft. Godfrey's papers all in order, his money untouched. Doctor says the poison was ingested not long before he died. within 10 minutes of the first sip. He must have trusted whoever poured it. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes following the slow drift of steam from the untouched cup before him. Trust is a dangerous thing, Inspector, especially in a man accustomed to suspicion. He gave her a quick glance, half a smile. You think it was someone he knew? Oh, undoubtedly. People rarely die by the hands of strangers in places like St. Mary Mead. Murder, you see, is very seldom impersonal. It's dreadfully domestic. Cray scribbled something in his notebook and muttered about letters, visitors, and a mysterious call Godfrey had made 2 nights before his death. When he left, he thanked her for the tea but forgot his umbrella, and Miss Marple watched him hurry down the lane, his coat flapping like a restless bird. She didn't leave the house that afternoon, but her mind was far from idle. The initials on the letter, C.L., lingered in her thoughts. She had gone through the register of the parish guild that morning while returning hymn books for the vicar's wife, and one name had caught her eye. Mrs. Constance Lyle, recently moved into the small house by the green, a widow, genteel, pleasant, and fond of talking about her late husband's work in the colonies. Miss Marple had seen her once at the post office, tall and graceful, with that slightly guarded air of a woman who wished to be seen as respectable but feared being remembered. By late afternoon, Miss Marple decided a visit was in order. She took a basket of freshly baked scones, ostensibly for welcome, and made her way through the damp lanes. Mrs. Lyle opened the door herself, her eyes widening slightly when she saw who stood there. "Miss Marple, how kind! Do come in. What dreadful weather!" The sitting room smelled faintly of lavender polish and something else. Cigars, Miss Marple realized. There was a small ashtray on the table, perfectly cleaned, but the scent lingered, stubborn and unmasked. They talked pleasantly at first, gardens, the vicar's new sermon, the rising cost of eggs. Miss Marple's manner was all gentle politeness, her gaze never intrusive, her questions shaped like idle curiosity. "I dare say you knew Inspector Godfrey," she said at last, folding her gloves neatly on her lap. Mrs. Lyle's smile wavered just slightly. "Why, yes. We were acquainted. He was kind enough to help me settle in when I first came, a very capable man." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "He always was, and very punctual. I remember he used to take his morning walk at precisely 8, rain or shine." Mrs. Lyle nodded, her fingers tightening slightly around her teacup. "Yes, he mentioned his routine often." Miss Marple took a small sip of her tea, then set it down. "It's odd, isn't it? How we all keep our little patterns, right up until something disturbs them. They say his gate was open that morning." Mrs. Lyle's hand trembled so slightly that only an eye trained by years of knitting could have noticed. "Oh, I hadn't heard." "No?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One hears such things, you know. The milk boy talks, the postmistress too. Small places are full of echoes." She rose after a few moments, thanking her hostess warmly and promising to send over some of her rose jam. When she stepped outside, the rain had stopped, and a pale shaft of light cut through the thinning mist. Miss Marple stood for a while by the gate, glancing down at the gravel path that led to the road. There were 2 sets of footprints, one faint, one newer, overlapping the other. She bent slightly, examining them, and murmured, "Curious. One arrives, one departs. But which was first?" When she returned home, she found the tabby cat asleep by the fire, purring softly. She sat beside it, her mind tracing every thread of the morning, 2 teacups, lipstick, CL, and now the scent of cigars in a house where no man lived. The pattern was growing clearer, though not yet complete. Somewhere between the faintest trace of smoke and the open gate, a single truth waited to be seen. That night, the rain returned in thin, restless streaks that drummed against the windows like anxious fingers. Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting untouched on her lap. The needles crossed in silence. The cat stirred once, then settled again, and the old clock on the mantel ticked with the kind of patience only the living can afford. She had spent the evening sorting her thoughts as neatly as one might sort skeins of wool. Yet one thread refused to stay in place, the matter of Mrs. Lyle. It was not merely that the woman had known Inspector Godfrey, that much could be innocent. It was that she had tried too hard to appear calm, too practiced in her responses, and that faint smell of cigars. Yes, that had been quite unmistakable. Miss Marple recalled how the inspector, years ago, had been fond of a particular Havana blend sold only by a tobacconist in Market Down. She remembered because he had once given the vicar a few, and the vicar had spent a week pretending not to cough. She rose and fetched her old umbrella. By morning, she had decided on a small errand to Market Down, quite legitimate in its purpose, though she suspected it would yield more than groceries. The shopkeeper, Mr. Greaves, was a man of few words and fewer expressions. When she mentioned the inspector, his eyebrows lifted just enough to show recollection. "Yes, ma'am. Fine gentleman. Used to buy his cigars here every fortnight. Haven't seen him in months, though. Except—" He paused, his fingers hovering over the cash drawer. "Someone came in last week asking for the same brand. Said they were a gift. A lady, well-dressed. Not from round here." "Did she leave her name?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Lyle, I think." "Mrs. Lyle?" On the walk home, the countryside lay muted under a dull sky, and the air smelled of damp leaves and distance. Miss Marple's mind turned slowly over the pieces now in her possession. The visit, the teacup, the open gate, the cigars. They were not yet a confession, but they were becoming a conversation, and one, she suspected, that had ended very suddenly. When she reached the village, she found Inspector Cray waiting by her gate again, looking as though he had slept in his office chair. "Ah, Miss Marple, thought I'd find you out and about. We've traced the poison. Digitalis, as you said. It came from a bottle prescribed to Mrs. Lyle 6 months ago. For her heart, apparently." Miss Marple did not feign surprise. "Ah, but of course. Hearts do have their complications, Inspector." He gave a weary chuckle. "You don't seem very shocked." "Not shocked," she replied softly. "Only sorry. You see, people who believe they're acting out of love often convince themselves it's justice." Cray frowned, but she did not explain further. Instead, she asked whether he might have a word with Mrs. Lyle again, perhaps this afternoon. "It's always best," she said, "to speak to people before they've had too much time to tidy their memories." By the time they reached Mrs. Lyle's house, the rain had stopped and the scent of wet earth hung heavily in the air. The widow greeted them with a composure that seemed rehearsed, her eyes flicking briefly to the inspector, then to Miss Marple. "I understand you've been unwell, Mrs. Lyle," Miss Marple said gently. "Such weather can't be good for one's nerves." "Oh, I'm quite all right," she replied, though her hands were clasped too tightly. Cray took a step forward. "We've a few more questions about the morning Inspector Godfrey died. You saw him that day, didn't you?" Mrs. Lyle hesitated. "He came to return a book." "Nothing more?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Ah, yes. People do borrow things, don't they? Sometimes hearts as well as books." The woman's composure faltered. Her breath caught, her gaze darted toward the empty ashtray on the table, as if she feared it might speak. "I dare say," Miss Marple continued quietly, "it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps he'd promised something, some affection, some protection, and failed to keep it. Men of conscience often think they can mend what ought to be left alone." A tear glimmered at the corner of Mrs. Lyle's eye, quickly brushed away. "He said he'd marry me," she whispered. "After his wife died, he said he would. But then he changed his mind. Said it wouldn't be proper, that people would talk." "And people always do," Miss Marple murmured. "You only meant to frighten him, perhaps? To make him understand what it felt like to lose control?" Mrs. Lyle's lips trembled, but she said nothing. Inspector Cray stepped forward, his voice steady but low. "The doctor can confirm the poison came from your prescription, ma'am. You should come with me." As they left, Miss Marple lingered by the gate once more. The same footprints remained faintly visible, softened by the rain, but she knew now which had come first. The inspector had arrived last and left only once, carried out on a stretcher. When she returned home, she poured herself a small cup of tea and sat in the fading light. The cat, faithful and untroubled, climbed into her lap. Miss Marple stroked its fur absently and whispered, "It's always the same, my dear. Hearts and habits, the two things that make us human and so terribly, terribly foolish." The following morning dawned unnaturally still, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Word had already spread that Mrs. Lyle had been taken to the county station for questioning. Some said she had confessed entirely, others that she had collapsed into hysterics and denied everything. The truth, as Miss Marple well knew, was rarely so simple. She sat quietly at her breakfast table, the newspaper folded beside her untouched porridge, reading between lines that were not yet printed. There was something that didn't fit. The pieces, though tidy in appearance, had that peculiar quality of having been arranged too neatly, as if someone had taken great care to make the puzzle appear solved. Mrs. Lyle might have administered the poison, yes, but Miss Marple had seen many guilty hands guided by cleverer ones. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray called again, a look of restless triumph half-shadowed by doubt. "We've got the full confession, Miss Marple," he announced. "She admitted to putting the digitalis in his tea. Said she only meant to scare him, but when he took the cup, she lost her nerve to stop him. I suppose that's the end of it." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with that mild, almost grandmotherly expression that hid more than it revealed. "Confessions, Inspector, are like lacework. They're very pretty, but one must be careful where the holes are." "Did she say how she got into the house?" "She said he invited her for breakfast." "How polite of him," murmured Miss Marple. "A man who had, just the evening before, told the grocer he was going away for a few days. Did you know that?" Cray blinked. "No, I didn't. He'd arranged to travel early that morning. Something about meeting a solicitor in Reading. It seems strange he'd invite company for tea, doesn't it?" The inspector frowned. "Then how did she get in?" "That," said Miss Marple softly, "is what's troubling me. Because if she went there expecting to plead with him, and he was already dead when she arrived, someone else must have opened the door." The idea hung between them, quiet but heavy. Cray began pacing, muttering about fingerprints, the timing of the doctor's report, the milk boy's statement. Miss Marple watched him for a while before saying gently, "It would be helpful to know who saw the inspector last. Alive, that is." By afternoon, Cray had gone to check records while Miss Marple took her customary walk through the village. She stopped at the post office under the pretense of collecting a parcel and lingered while Miss Carrow sorted letters behind the counter. "Such a dreadful business," said Miss Carrow with relish. "Though between you and me, he was here the day before he died. Sent a telegram, he did." "Really?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened. "And to whom, if you remember?" "Oh, that's the odd part. Addressed to a Mr. Stanley Webb, London. Said he'd found something and it was worth a look. That's all I saw." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind turning over the name like a pebble in water. Stanley Webb. She had heard it once before, years ago, mentioned in passing by Colonel Melchett when discussing a case Inspector Godfrey had been involved in. A fraud inquiry that had ended rather abruptly. Webb had been the accused, a man of means and temper who had vanished before trial. That evening, Inspector Cray returned, damp from the mist and visibly unsettled. "You were right, Miss Marple. Godfrey was planning a trip. Found the ticket in his pocket, and we've traced that telegram. Webb's been in the country again. Came down from London 3 days ago, There's a record of him staying at the King's Arms, just 5 miles away." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly on her lap. "Then it seems Mrs. Lyle may have been caught in someone else's game. A woman scorned is easy to use, Inspector, especially by men who know how to play upon pain." Cray rubbed his temples. "You think Webb followed him here?" "I think," she said slowly, "that Inspector Godfrey had uncovered something, and someone wanted it silenced before it could surface. The poison was convenient, but not precise. It was meant to frame, not merely to kill." The inspector looked at her sharply. "And what do you suggest we do?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but steady. "Invite Mr. Webb for a little talk. Men who believe themselves clever are always eager to show how much they know, especially when they think the danger has passed." That night, when she closed her curtains, the mist outside had thickened into a pale, shifting fog that seemed to breathe along the hedgerows. Miss Marple stood there for a long while, her reflection mingling with the grey beyond the glass, and thought of all the times she'd seen pride masquerade as justice. The truth, she knew, had a habit of revealing itself only when one stopped looking for a villain and began looking for a wound. 2 days later, the fog still lay thick over the village green, softening the world into grey silhouettes. Life in St. Mary Mead had resumed its surface, calm, but conversation at the butcher's or the vicarage tea-table always found its way back to Inspector Godfrey. Some felt pity for Mrs. Lyle. Others whispered she had escaped the noose through tears and cleverness. Miss Marple knew better than to accept either view. People in small villages preferred stories that fit neatly into sentences. The truth was seldom so polite. Inspector Cray came again that morning, looking less certain than before. He had arranged for Stanley Webb to be brought in for questioning. "We found him at the King's Arms," he said, removing his hat. "He admitted knowing Godfrey in the past, but insists he hadn't seen him in years. Claimed he came down to the country for peace and quiet. Doesn't strike me as the peaceful type." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Men who come for quiet usually bring their noise with them, Inspector." "Did he say what he did on the morning of the murder?" Cray flipped open his notebook. "Breakfast at the inn. Left just before 8. No one saw him again until nearly noon. Says he went walking." "Ah, yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Men who go walking alone are always so difficult to disprove." The inspector frowned. "You think he's lying?" "I think," she said, pouring him tea, "that he's a man revisiting unfinished business. Inspector Godfrey's telegram proves he was expecting a meeting, but if he invited Webb, why not at the inn? Why insist on breakfast at home with his gate half open?" Cray tapped his pencil. "You mean Webb might have gone there early, maybe to threaten him?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "But remember, Inspector Godfrey was cautious. He would not have let such a man in without reason. There must have been something between them, a bargain perhaps, or a secret. Something valuable enough to risk a visit before dawn." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the post office under the pretense of mailing a letter. Miss Carrow, who never needed encouragement to talk, mentioned that a parcel addressed to the late Inspector Godfrey had arrived from London the very morning of his death. "Strange timing, isn't it?" she said. "It was sent special delivery. The constable collected it after, of course." Miss Marple's mind stirred. A parcel arriving that morning, before the inspector died, and he had told the grocer he would be away afterward. Whatever it was, he'd meant to take it with him. When Cray brought her to the station to see it, she wasn't surprised to find the box small, heavy, and wrapped in thick brown paper. Inside lay a single item, a black notebook bound in leather, its edges worn. The first page held neat handwriting, Inspector Godfrey's. The rest, however, was filled with other hands, ledgers, names, dates, and the faint, unmistakable scent of cigar smoke clinging to the paper. "An old case file," Cray muttered. "Fraud, bribery, government contracts. Good Lord, this ties Webb to 3 investigations. No wonder he disappeared." Miss Marple nodded slowly. And no wonder Godfrey sent that telegram. He'd found his missing evidence. I imagine Mr. Webb's walk took him straight to that cottage. The conversation turned ugly. Perhaps he forced Godfrey to sit down and have a friendly cup of tea, then slipped out while the poison did its work. He left the lipstick cup behind to make it look as though Mrs. Lyle had been there. Cray's eyes widened. So the poison wasn't hers at all. He stole it. Likely so. The prescription bottle was missing for weeks before she noticed, no doubt thinking she'd misplaced it. Mr. Webb was a clever man, Inspector, but not quite clever enough to account for the smallest habits of village life. The gossip of a postmistress, the memory of a grocer, the open gate noticed by an old woman who sees everything. That evening, as the sun broke weakly through the fog, Cray returned with the news that Webb had been arrested trying to leave by the early train. The notebook in his possession had been replaced by a bundle of blank pages. Miss Marple had already expected as much. A man like that always prepares a decoy, she said, smiling faintly. But he forgot something no decoy can imitate, a conscience. And Inspector Godfrey left enough of his behind to lead you straight to the truth. When the case was finally closed, the village settled back into its rhythms, though the air seemed quieter somehow, humbled by the things it had overheard. Mrs. Lyle was released, her heart weaker but her eyes strangely peaceful. Miss Marple visited her once, leaving a basket of scones and a few kind words neither woman needed to explain. That night, as she drew her curtains against the pale glow of the street lamp, Miss Marple thought of Inspector Godfrey, not as a man betrayed by a woman or a criminal, but as one undone by his faith in reason over emotion. Men, she murmured to the sleeping cat, so often forget that the smallest human feeling can tip the scales between justice and tragedy. The cat purred softly in its sleep, and outside, the fog at last began to lift. Though Webb's arrest had brought a certain closure, Miss Marple knew that peace in St. Mary Mead was never as complete as it appeared. The newspapers praised Inspector Cray for his quick resolution. The villagers resumed their chatter about flower shows and weather, and Mrs. Lyle began appearing again at church, pale but determined to seem untroubled. Yet something about the matter refused to settle in Miss Marple's mind. Truth, she often thought, was like embroidery. If one thread was pulled too tightly, another somewhere else would pucker. Late one afternoon, as she tended her garden, she noticed the postboy cycling down the lane with unusual haste. He stopped by her gate and handed her a letter bearing no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar, bold and slanted, the same that had marked the note tied to Inspector Godfrey's bundle of letters, C.L., but this one was unsigned. She opened it at once. There were only a few lines, written in a trembling hand. He didn't act alone. Beware of the man with the scar. Miss Marple stood motionless for a long time, the paper trembling between her fingers. The words had that urgent quality of truth forced out under fear. She folded the note neatly, slipped it into her apron, and looked toward the horizon where the sky was dimming into gray. She had suspected as much. Stanley Webb was too careful, too methodical to have risked his neck alone. He had always been the face of such schemes, not the architect. That evening she called upon Inspector Cray, who greeted her with weary relief. "Please don't tell me you've found another complication," he sighed. "I'm afraid so," Miss Marple said gently. "This came today." She handed him the note. Cray read it, his expression tightening. "Another man? With a scar? We've no record of one in Webb's circle." "No official record, perhaps," she murmured. But Webb couldn't have intercepted the parcel from London on his own. He'd need help to divert it, to replace its contents, and to plant the poisoned tea before Mrs. Lyle arrived. Someone local, someone who knew the habits of both men. "I rather think the scar will prove more domestic than you imagine." Cray frowned. "Domestic?" "Village domestic," Miss Marple clarified, her tone mild but precise. The kind of man who lingers near post offices, fetches telegrams, and knows which mornings the milk arrives. People forget how much harm can be done by those who are thought to be useful. The inspector stared at her for a moment before understanding began to dawn. "You mean Thompson, the constable, the one who found the body?" Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "He was the first to arrive, yes? And he was also the one who told you about the tea, wasn't he? How odd, since only the doctor had examined it by then. A very clever man, our Constable Thompson, clever enough to tell half-truths and let others finish them." By dawn the next day, Thompson had vanished. His bicycle was found abandoned near the river, and a small suitcase missing from his lodgings. The village awoke to whispers once again, and Inspector Cray, grim-faced, came to Miss Marple for counsel. "He's run, that's certain," he said. "But why risk everything for a man like Webb?" "Loyalty," Miss Marple replied. "Or fear, perhaps both. People like Thompson are often drawn to strength they mistake for purpose. Webb must have offered him something, money perhaps, or protection, but fear drives faster than greed, and fear has no direction once it's loosed." They found him 2 days later, not far from the river bank, exhausted, cold, and trying to board a morning train. The scar, small, pale, and running from his ear to his jaw, was barely visible beneath his stubble, but Miss Marple noticed it at once when she visited the station after his capture. He could not meet her eyes. "I never meant for the inspector to die," he muttered. "Webb said it would only make him ill enough to bargain. Said he'd pay me double if I helped. But when the man fell, when he didn't move, I knew." His voice cracked. "I thought I'd just watch over things until the fuss passed. I didn't count on you noticing the gate." Miss Marple regarded him with quiet sorrow. "People seldom do, Constable. But I dare say you knew long before I did that good intentions make very poor company when fear comes calling." The confession sealed the matter. Webb and Thompson were both taken away within the week, and St. Mary Mead exhaled the deep sigh of a place restored to its habitual calm. But Miss Marple remained uneasy. Evil, she reflected, was never entirely vanquished. It simply changed its voice. That evening, as she poured a fresh cup of tea, she thought of Inspector Godfrey's open gate, Mrs. Lyle's trembling hands, and Thompson's scar, each a small piece of an ordinary life, yet together enough to end it. Outside, the wind rustled through the hedges, carrying faint echoes of gossip and laughter once more. She stirred her tea, her eyes soft with melancholy. "It's a strange world," she whispered to the empty room. "People do the gravest things not out of hatred, but out of fright, and always, always in silence." The cat purred at her feet, the clock chimed 9, and St. Mary Mead, ever tidy in its tragedies, slipped quietly back into peace. A week passed, and the air in St. Mary Mead began to clear, though not entirely of unease. The village had slipped back into its familiar rhythms, church bells, gossip over hedges, the faint sound of milk bottles clinking at dawn. But beneath the calm there lingered something unsettled, like the echo of a bell long after it had been struck. Miss Marple sensed it most keenly when she passed the old inspector's cottage, now shuttered and silent. There was an unfinished feeling about the place, as if the truth had been uncovered but not entirely understood. Inspector Cray had been, by the day before, looking more at ease than she'd yet seen him. "Webb and Thompson have both been transferred to London," he'd said. "The case will close quietly now. You were right all along, of course. We've even recovered some of the stolen funds Webb hid in an old storage account." Miss Marple had smiled politely but said little. It wasn't pride that kept her quiet, only that she disliked endings that arrived too cleanly. Life, in her experience, rarely tied itself up with a neat bow. That sense of unfinished business stayed with her, threading through her thoughts even as she baked, wrote letters, or trimmed her roses. It was on a mild afternoon, while returning from the vicarage, that she noticed something peculiar. A man standing outside the late Inspector Godfrey's gate, looking not at the house but at the ground. He was tall, plainly dressed, with the weary posture of one who carries too much of the world inside himself. When he realized he was being watched, he straightened, touched his hat, and said, "Beg pardon, ma'am. I was looking for Miss Marple, actually." "You've found her," she replied gently, "though you've come to a curious place to do it." The man smiled faintly. "Name's Peter Godfrey. My uncle was the inspector." She studied him quietly. There was a likeness in the eyes, a certain intelligence tempered by sadness. "You've come about his affairs, I suppose?" "Yes. The solicitors wrote to me. I've been going through his papers." He paused, glancing at the cottage again. "There's something strange, Miss Marple. Something that doesn't match what they told me in London." "Go on," she said softly. He produced a small envelope from his coat. Inside was a single page torn from the inspector's notebook, the same leather-bound one that had caused so much trouble. But this page bore a date written after the supposed completion of his investigation. Beneath it, in his precise handwriting, was a single line. "If anything happens to me, ask the woman with the silver hair about the ledger." Miss Marple's gaze flickered briefly toward the horizon, where the church spire rose like a quiet warning. "The woman with the silver hair," she repeated thoughtfully. "And what did the police say about this?" Peter hesitated. "I haven't told them. Not yet. I thought perhaps you'd know who he meant." Miss Marple folded the note carefully and handed it back. "There are many women in this village with silver hair, Mr. Godfrey, but only a few with reasons to fear your uncle's notebook." That evening she sat by her window long after the lamps were lit, thinking. The phrase turned over in her mind again and again. The woman with the silver hair. Mrs. Lyle's hair was dark, Miss Carrow's fair. Only one name surfaced with a kind of quiet inevitability. Mrs. Price Ridley. The same Mrs. Price Ridley who had been so eager to spread gossip after the inspector's death, so certain that poison had been used, long before anyone else had known. The next morning, Miss Marple called upon her under the guise of returning a borrowed embroidery pattern. Mrs. Price Ridley received her with her usual mixture of curiosity and condescension. "Such a terrible business," she said, setting down her teacup. "Though really, I always said Inspector Godfrey would come to a bad end. Far too many secrets for one man." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Secrets do tend to catch up with people, even those who think they're safely buried." Mrs. Price Ridley's laugh was brittle. "Well, I suppose you would know. You always did take an interest in such matters." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her tone light but precise. "Oh, only when they touch on friends. I was thinking, for instance, of how very perceptive you were about the poison. One might almost say you recognized its nature before the doctor did." There was a pause, a heartbeat too long. Mrs. Price Ridley's smile faltered. "I only repeated what I heard, surely." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But you see, no one had said digitalis yet when you spoke of it. That knowledge must have come from somewhere." The woman's fingers tightened around her teacup. "You're imagining things, Miss Marple." "Perhaps," she murmured. "Though your brother did work at the chemist's, didn't he? Before he passed." The silence that followed was fragile and immense. Miss Marple rose, offering her the folded embroidery pattern with a kind nod. "It must be dreadful, Mrs. Price Ridley, to hold on to another man's secret all these years, especially when he's dead and cannot keep his half of the bargain." She left the house quietly, walking through the lane where the mist still clung between the hedges. Behind her, through the lace-curtained window, she saw the faint tremor of a curtain drawn shut. That evening, Inspector Cray came to her door again, looking troubled. Price Ridley's maid just found her collapsed in her chair. "Heart failure, the doctor says." Miss Marple sighed softly. Digitalis again, I presume. He blinked. How did you know? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she poured him tea and looked into the fire, her voice calm and distant. Because secrets, Inspector, have a way of circling back to their makers. They never die a natural death. They simply wait for the right moment to be remembered. Outside, the church bell began to toll, slow and solemn, echoing through the stillness of St. Mary Mead. And in that sound, Miss Marple heard what she always did at the end of such things. Not triumph, not relief, but the quiet, endless sorrow of human folly repeating itself once more. The next day dawned pale and windless, the sort of morning that seemed to erase the edges of everything it touched. A quietness lay over St. Mary Mead, too complete to be comforting. The news of Mrs. Price Ridley's sudden death had spread with unsettling speed, but the details, her half-finished tea, the faint traces of digitalis, were spoken of only in whispers. There was something indecent, after all, about discussing a woman who had been so devoted to discussing everyone else. Miss Marple sat by her hearth, the morning paper folded untouched beside her. She had not slept well. Death, when it came so swiftly after revelation, rarely traveled alone. It carried with it the shadow of unfinished consequence. She knew that whatever Mrs. Price Ridley had been hiding had not died with her. It had merely changed hands. Someone else, she felt sure, had found reason to keep that secret buried. Inspector Cray arrived near noon, his manner taut and weary. "You were right again," he said without preamble. "Digitalis. Same concentration, same preparation, but this time it wasn't self-administered. The cup was poured for her by someone else." "Ah," murmured Miss Marple. "The hand that closes the circle." Cray looked at her sharply. "Meaning?" "She was a part of it, Inspector, not merely a bystander. I believe she and Webb shared more than a few confidences, and that her brother, before his death, supplied both of them with the means to alter records and prescriptions. The inspector's notes threatened them all, but her usefulness ended once Webb and Thompson were caught." Cray's jaw tightened. "You think someone came back to silence her?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her eyes fixed on the slow dance of the fire, "that someone never left." There was a pause in which the ticking clock seemed suddenly loud. Then she rose and took a small envelope from her writing desk. "Mr. Peter Godfrey brought this to me yesterday, the page his uncle wrote. I believe there's more to it than a warning. Look closely at the word ledger. It's written with a heavier hand, almost scored into the paper. A man like Inspector Godfrey didn't emphasize carelessly." Cray bent over the note, his brow furrowed. "You think it refers to something else?" "To the book itself," said Miss Marple softly. "Not the copy found in the parcel, but the real one. He must have hidden it after sending the decoy. A ledger, by nature, is meant to record transactions, debts, obligations. What if the inspector's ledger held evidence of all those in this village who benefited from Webb's dealings? If so, he'd have known that his death would not stop them, that someone local still owed a great deal to silence." Cray exhaled slowly. "And where would he have hidden it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Somewhere safe, somewhere no one but he, and perhaps someone very observant, would think to look. The inspector's habits were tidy. He disliked clutter, yet his desk drawers were too neat for a man of constant correspondence. When tidiness becomes a performance, Inspector, it's usually concealing disorder." By late afternoon they stood once more inside the inspector's cottage. The light through the lace curtains had a washed grey look, touching everything with the melancholy of neglect. Miss Marple moved quietly through the sitting room, eyes taking in every familiar detail: the untouched clock, the row of books, the tidy writing table. She stopped before a framed photograph above the mantel. "His wife," she said softly. "She died before he retired. I recall hearing she loved violets. He kept some pressed between the pages of her Bible." Gently, she lifted the old volume from the sideboard and turned it over in her hands. The binding creaked faintly, the pages smelling of dust and lavender. Between the psalms lay the pressed flowers, and beneath them, almost invisible, a thin slit cut into the paper backing. Miss Marple drew out a folded sheaf of pages bound in ribbon. Cray's eyes widened. "The ledger." "Yes," said Miss Marple, her tone almost tender, "and now we shall see who else feared. Its discovery." Inside were names, 5 of them. Some known to London, some not. Among them, to Cray's shock, was one that struck closer to home. The name of Dr. Fletcher, the very man who had examined both bodies and pronounced them poisoned. Cray swore softly. He was part of it all along. He must have ensured the doses matched, the same preparation, the same signature, so that both deaths looked like accidents of irony. Miss Marple nodded. A clever man, but vain. He thought he could tidy away the past like a surgeon closes a wound. Yet wounds like these never heal cleanly. That evening, the doctor was quietly taken into custody after a brief, trembling denial. His guilt unraveled quickly under the weight of his own handwriting found in the ledger. Receipts, altered prescriptions, and letters to Webb signed under a false name. When at last Inspector Cray returned to Miss Marple's cottage, it was nearly midnight. He looked older, humbled, and oddly grateful. "You've done it again," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "Not done, Inspector. Only finished for now. Evil in villages like ours doesn't end. It merely takes another shape. But for tonight," she added, pouring him a cup of tea, "we may let it rest." Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping gently on the panes like a memory returning home. Miss Marple sat quietly, hands folded, her eyes reflecting the small, steady flame of the hearth. The village, she knew, would forget in time, but she would remember, as she always did, that behind every act of wickedness there lingered something heartbreakingly human: fear, pride, and the fatal desire to appear good. And somewhere beyond the hedges, the night closed over St. Mary Mead once more, leaving only silence to keep its watch. The next morning arrived with a brittle sunlight that scattered across the rooftops, sharp and colorless after a night of rain. The village moved slowly, cautiously, as though uncertain whether the storm, whatever form it had taken, had truly passed. Miss Marple, however, rose early, her mind already tracing the quiet echoes left behind. The ledger had been found, the doctor arrested, and justice, as far as the law was concerned, had been served. Yet she sensed the faint hum of something unresolved, an unease that clung not to guilt, but to memory. After breakfast, she decided to walk to the inspector's cottage one final time. The constable stationed at the door nodded to her, weary but polite. "They're clearing the place, Miss Marple. Evidence all packed up. Inspector Cray says he's closing the file this week." "Quite right," she said mildly. "Though I should like a small word with him before he does. There's something rather important I've not yet told him." Cray arrived not long after, his coat unbuttoned, his expression more relaxed than it had been in days. "You've come to bid farewell to the scene, I suppose?" he said with a half-smile. "In a manner of speaking," Miss Marple replied, her gaze resting on the writing desk. "But you see, I've been thinking about the ledger. It explains much, but not everything. For instance, why would a man like Inspector Godfrey, who knew his life was in danger, choose to stay in that cottage alone? Why not leave at once? He wasn't a fool." Cray frowned. He wanted to confront Webb, perhaps. He sent that telegram. He thought he could handle it. Perhaps. But I think he stayed because of something far more personal. You see, I looked again at his notes. In the margins of one page, there's a name written and then crossed out. M. Ridley. Not Mrs. Price Ridley, mind you, but her son. The one who went abroad some years ago after unpleasant trouble in London. Cray's face stiffened. You think the son was involved too?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that he was here, hidden in plain sight. The telegram to Webb mentioned an accomplice close to home. And who better than the son of a woman Webb had compromised for years? Mrs. Price Ridley protected him, perhaps even blackmailed the doctor into falsifying his identity. It explains her hold over him, her fear, and her silence." The inspector drew a long breath. "Then where is he now?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the garden outside the window, where the ivy climbed thick and green along the low wall. "Still here, I imagine," she murmured. "Your men searched the house thoroughly, but not the garden shed, did they? It's been locked since the morning of the inspector's death. I asked the constable, and he said no one had the key. Within the hour, they forced the door open. The faint smell of oil and damp earth filled the air. Inside, beneath an old tarpaulin, lay a small trunk half covered in dust. When they lifted it, the lock gave way easily, and within, folded neatly as if waiting for discovery, were several envelopes, each addressed in Godfrey's unmistakable hand. The first was sealed to M. Ridley. The others bore no name, only the word confession. Cray opened the topmost envelope carefully. Inside was a brief note in the inspector's steady script. "You are never the man they thought you were, Michael. You were better once. Do not let Webb make you worse." Beneath it was a photograph. Mrs. Price Ridley in younger years, standing beside a boy with dark eyes and a defiant smile. Miss Marple turned away, her expression unreadable. He must have come to see her the night before the murder. Webb used him to deliver the poison, and when she realized what he'd done, she tried to hide him. But guilt never stays hidden for long. Cray looked grave. "So he's gone again?" "I rather think not," Miss Marple said softly. "The train station keeps records of every ticket sold. If you check, you'll find that one was purchased 2 days ago under the name Martin Price, bound for Dover, and beyond that, France, perhaps, a country with short memories." When the inspector left, she remained alone in the little cottage, gazing out at the thin mist curling over the hedges. The story had ended, yes, but endings were rarely tidy. Somewhere across the channel, a frightened man was beginning a new life under an old name. Somewhere beneath the churchyard soil, his mother rested beside the silence she'd spent her life guarding. Miss Marple stood for a moment longer, then reached out and closed the gate behind her. It clicked softly into place. She thought, as she walked back toward the village, of how love and fear, guilt and mercy, so often tangled together until they were indistinguishable. People imagined evil was born of hatred, but in her long life, she had found it more often sprouting from the quieter roots of affection. By the time she reached her cottage, the first faint chime of evening bells had begun. She lit her lamp, poured herself a small cup of tea, and smiled faintly at the cat asleep in its chair. "Well, my dear," she murmured, "it seems even the dead have their confidences, and we mustn't begrudge them that." The wind rose outside, gentle but steady, carrying away the last whispers of scandal from St. Mary Mead. Within the warm circle of her lamp, Miss Marple sat perfectly still, her thoughts already receding into the calm of knowing too much and saying nothing at all. Autumn arrived quietly that year, laying a pale gold hush across the village. The scandal of Inspector Godfrey's murder had faded into something half-remembered, spoken of only when the evenings grew long, and people sought stories to warm the dark. The younger folk of St. Mary Mead said Miss Marple had once solved a dreadful crime with nothing but her knitting and her wits, though none could quite agree on the details. Miss Marple, for her part, neither confirmed nor denied it. She spent her days much as before, attending to her garden, taking tea with the vicar's wife, and observing the endlessly fascinating theatre of human nature that unfolded just beyond her gate. But some evenings, when the mist came low and the wind sighed through the hedges, She would find her thoughts drifting back to Inspector Godfrey's cottage. She never admitted it aloud, but she felt the faintest tug of something unfinished, like a page left unturned. Not suspicion exactly, more the sense that a story, once told, had not yet spoken its last word. It was on one such evening, as she sat alone by her fire, that a knock came at the door. The sound was hesitant, almost apologetic. When she opened it, she found a young woman standing there, no more than 25, her eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Miss Marple?" the girl asked softly. I was told you might help me. My name is Ellen Godfrey." The name struck like a soft echo through the room. "Inspector Godfrey's niece," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes, of course." "Do come in, my dear." Ellen entered, clutching a small leather satchel to her chest. She sat by the fire, her face pale in the glow. "I've come from London," she said after a pause. "My father, Peter, he told me about what happened here, but there's something he didn't understand. Something he asked me to find." Miss Marple listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. The girl drew a folded paper from her satchel and placed it on the table. It was another page from the inspector's notebook, one Miss Marple had never seen. The handwriting was his, clear and deliberate. The truth is never in what they say, but in what they fear to lose. Below it, a name had been scrawled in haste and underlined twice. "Eleanor." Miss Marple frowned. "Eleanor? My grandmother," Ellen said softly. "Inspector Godfrey's wife." "But she's been dead for years," Miss Marple murmured. "He kept her Bible and her photograph on the mantel." Ellen nodded. "Yes, but I don't think she died as everyone believed. My father found a letter, one she wrote to him before she passed. It said she feared for her husband, that he was entangled in something dangerous, and that someone was using her illness to control him." Miss Marple leaned back slowly. "So perhaps the roots of all this go deeper than we thought. The ledger, the poison, even Webb, they may have been only the final bloom of a seed planted long ago." Ellen's voice trembled. "I think my grandfather was killed not because of what he found, but because of what he'd hidden. My grandmother knew something he couldn't destroy." For a long moment the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was already turning with quiet precision. She had seen too often how the past, if buried improperly, had a way of clawing itself back to the surface. She rose and took her shawl from the peg. "My dear," she said calmly, "I believe it's time we paid one last visit to the inspector's cottage. There are still corners in that place where truth prefers to whisper rather than be seen." They walked through the narrow lanes in silence, the air crisp and smelling faintly of wood smoke. The cottage loomed ahead, dark against the twilight. Inside, dust had settled like fine ash over the furniture, but the atmosphere held an almost palpable watchfulness, as though something within waited to be noticed. Miss Marple went straight to the mantel, to the photograph of Eleanor Godfrey. Her eyes lingered on the frame, heavy, brass, and slightly tarnished. With a deft motion, she lifted it from its hook and turned it over. The back was sealed with thin paper, yellowed by time. She peeled it away carefully, and there, folded between the cardboard backing and the photograph, was a small key tied with faded violet ribbon. Ellen gasped. "Her favorite color," she whispered. Miss Marple held the key up to the light. "And one that opened something close to her heart, no doubt." A careful search of the room revealed a locked compartment at the base of the old sideboard. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a small tin box lined with linen and a single sealed envelope. Miss Marple handed it to Ellen, who broke the wax and read aloud. "To whomever finds this, if my husband should die under strange circumstances, know that it was not by chance. There are those within his own circle who traded lives for silence. I've kept their names here, hidden, so the truth might live if we do not." Below the letter lay a folded list. Ellen's hand shook as she opened it. Miss Marple read the names in silence. 4 of them already known, but one that had never appeared in the ledger. Inspector Cray. The wind stirred the curtains, and the silence in the room grew heavy and absolute. Miss Marple did not speak for a long while. When she did, her voice was very soft, almost sorrowful. "You see, my dear, the truth rarely ends where we wish it to. It turns upon itself until those who sought justice find themselves bound by it." Ellen's eyes filled with tears. "What should we do?" Miss Marple took the list, folded it neatly, and placed it back in the tin. "For now," she said, "we do nothing. Let the truth rest where it's safe. It will find its way to daylight when the world is ready to hear it." As they left the cottage, the first stars began to appear through the thinning clouds. Miss Marple walked slowly, her shawl drawn close, her face unreadable in the dusk. She knew that some truths, once uncovered, did not belong to this world's keeping, and that sometimes mercy was the only justice left to give. Behind them, the cottage stood quiet once more, its secrets returned to silence. But in Miss Marple's mind, the faint echo of that last name lingered like a closing chord that refused to fade. The days that followed were unnervingly calm. The village, unaware of the paper Miss Marple had quietly folded back into its hiding place, went about its small routines, the postman whistling down the lane, the vicar's wife rehearsing hymns for Harvest Sunday, and Mrs. Bantry sending out invitations for her autumn luncheon, as if the past year had contained nothing but mild gossip and garden pests. But for Miss Marple, the quiet had taken on a new texture. Every sound seemed to hold its own meaning, every face its own silence. Inspector Cray came once more, a visit that felt less official than customary. He looked drawn, older perhaps, though he spoke with forced lightness. "London's satisfied," he said, accepting tea. "The files are closed, the press has moved on. No more shadows to chase." Miss Marple stirred her cup with calm precision. "You must be relieved." Cray gave a thin smile. "Relief's a strange thing. You think it will feel like release, but it just feels hollow." She regarded him for a moment, her pale eyes gentle but unyielding. "That is the difficulty with endings, Inspector. They rarely behave." He met her gaze briefly, then looked away. "You've a way of making a man feel seen, Miss Marple. Almost too seen." When he left, she walked him to the gate, her hand resting lightly on the latch. He paused there, his expression oddly reflective. "You know," he said, "I keep wondering whether old Godfrey might have expected me to finish his work. He wrote that man's name, mine, in his wife's letter. Strange, isn't it? I keep thinking there's something in it I'll never quite see." Miss Marple's voice was soft. "Perhaps, Inspector, what he saw in you wasn't condemnation, but trust." He studied her, uncertain, then gave a quiet nod and walked away down the lane. She watched until he disappeared around the bend, the faint scrape of gravel marking his steps, and then she turned back inside. That night she could not sleep. The wind had risen again, pulling faint sighs through the chimney, and the fire on her hearth had burned down to a low red glow. She sat with her knitting untouched on her lap, thinking of Ellen Godfrey's frightened eyes, of Eleanor's trembling handwriting, of a man who had once believed the law could separate guilt from grief, and of another man, still living, whose conscience was not yet done with him. A faint tapping drew her attention to the window. She rose and opened it slightly. A folded note had been wedged under the sill. She unfolded it under the lamplight. There were only a few words, written in a hand she recognized. "The ledger is gone. It wasn't the only copy." Miss Marple stood very still. The message could have meant anything, or everything. She folded the paper once, twice, then dropped it into the fire. The flames curled around it quickly, erasing the ink before it could speak further. In the morning she went about her usual tasks, tending the roses, calling briefly on Mrs. Bantry, smiling as the butcher's boy told her of his mother's new hens. But something in her step was slower, her manner quieter. That evening, when she returned home, she found a small parcel waiting on her table, bearing no name. Inside was a book, a copy of a police procedural from London, long out of print, and a single sprig of pressed violets laid between the first pages. She touched the petals lightly. Beneath them, written in a firm, familiar hand, was a single line. For the truth which no one owns. She closed the book gently and set it beside the fire. Outside, the dusk gathered again, cloaking the hedgerows in soft shadow. Somewhere, perhaps far from St. Mary Mead, a new story had already begun, its first page written in the same ink as the last. Miss Marple, seated by the window, watched the light fade until the room grew dark. Then she smiled faintly. Her voice a whisper meant only for the night. "Ah, well," she said, "the world is full of secrets, and it seems it means to keep them." The fire flickered, then steadied. In its glow, the old woman's face was calm, unreadable, and quietly knowing, as if she too understood that some truths were never meant to end. The next morning dawned brittle and pale, with a faint frost glazing the grass and a thin mist curling through the hedgerows. Miss Marple woke earlier than usual, though she could not have said why. Some instinct, old and wordless, had stirred her from sleep. The small parcel from the night before still lay on the table, the pressed violets resting where she'd left them. She looked at them for a long while before touching the edge of the page again. The inscription, "For the truth which no one owns," seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, like something not yet finished. After breakfast, she wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and went out for her customary walk. The air was sharp enough to sting, and the village seemed unusually still. The milk boy called a greeting, but there was no laughter in it. Something unseen had settled over St. Mary Mead once again, a quiet unease, thin but persistent, like a thread that refused to break. At the post office, Miss Carroll was sorting letters behind the counter, her usual briskness tempered by gossip she was clearly trying to withhold. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice. "Have you heard? Inspector Cray's been called back to London. Suddenly, they say. No one knows why." Miss Marple's hand paused as she accepted her post. "No reason given?" "None. Just a telegram early this morning. Looked pale as a ghost when he left. And there's talk that the constable sent with him didn't come back." Miss Marple thanked her, stepping back into the chill air with her thoughts quietly in motion. Cray's departure, so abrupt, so secretive, troubled her. She had seen the exhaustion in his eyes the last time they had spoken, the subtle weight of something left unsaid. And now, a vanished assistant, a cryptic note, and a pressed violet. The pattern was beginning again, though most would never see it. By the time she returned home, the afternoon light had turned thin and grey. A motor car was waiting near her gate, its engine idling softly. From it stepped Peter Godfrey, his hat in hand, his face drawn but resolute. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "I'm sorry to intrude. I've just come from London. I thought you ought to know. Inspector Cray's been found dead." She did not speak. The sound of the wind seemed to grow louder in the pause that followed. Peter went on, the words tumbling out with the breathlessness of disbelief. "It looks like an accident, a fall from the embankment near the station. But they say his briefcase was gone, the one with the case notes. Every document tied to the Godfrey investigation, missing." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the constable?" "Vanished," he said. "No trace. The papers think it's a robbery, but I know better. Cray wasn't a man to lose his footing." She moved to the window, gazing out at the fields shrouded in mist. "No, she said softly. Nor was he a man to surrender a secret he'd promised to keep. The truth does not die quietly, Mr. Godfrey. It lingers, like smoke that finds its way back into a room no matter how tightly one shuts the doors. He hesitated. Do you think it's connected to the list? I think, she murmured, that whoever sent that parcel meant for me to see the beginning, not the end. And now the ledger's gone, and so is Cray. The pattern is repeating itself, but in silence this time. That night, as the frost deepened, Miss Marple lit her lamp and opened the old police manual again. There was nothing inside now, no note, no flower. Only the faintest trace of violet pressed into the paper like a ghost of something once alive. She studied it for a long time, then reached for her notebook and wrote a single line. The ledger may burn, but memory does not. She sat back, folded her hands, and listened to the ticking of the clock. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. The world outside seemed motionless, suspended between knowing and forgetting. Miss Marple leaned closer to the fire, her expression unreadable, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. "It isn't over," she said. "It never is." The flame flickered once, as if in answer, before settling again into its steady, patient glow.